If you are struggling to dunk, then this video is for you. What's up guys, my name is John Evans. I coach many of the highest jumpers in the world, like Isaiah Rivera, Donovan Hawkins, Dominic Gonzalez, and the list goes on and on. In this video, we're going to be going over exactly what your limitation is when it comes to making your first dunk. So the first limitation is going to be your height and reach. Now this may seem obvious, but if you're a taller athlete, then you're going to have a higher reach. Now it doesn't necessarily matter how tall you are, but it is very important to consider your actual reach, or how high you can touch with one hand up in the air, the other arm depressed. For example, T-Dub has a standing height of about 5'9", but his standing reach is somewhere around 7'11" or 8 feet. He has incredibly long arms, and this is super helpful when it comes to getting your first dunk. Now you can't change this, so there isn't really a point in talking about it too much, but it is something to consider that if you have a relatively low reach, really anything under about 7'8", you're gonna need to jump considerably higher. A few considerations if you are on the shorter side, I would encourage you to jump off 2 feet. The reason why is because 2 foot is a lot more modifiable than 1 foot. 1 foot relies heavily on rate of force development, which is much harder and much more sensitive of a metric to improve. The next thing stopping you from getting your first dunk is obviously your vertical. Now this relates to the first one in that if you have a lower reach, then you're gonna need a higher vertical. But the number one thing that's gonna determine this is going to be your ability to train effectively for a long period of time and your genetics. Your vertical is modifiable. It is not something that is set in stone. It's not purely genetic. It's just that how much you respond to training is dictated by your genetics, and then also where your baseline is also going to be dictated by your genetics. For example, you might be a crazy athlete like Donovan, and your baseline vertical might be 43 inches after jumping once or twice a week for a year or two. That's gonna be a lot easier for you to dunk, even if you are 5'6" with a 7'2" reach, than it is for someone that's baseline is like 29 inches. However, someone that has a 29-inch vertical might be a great responder to training. They might have better tendons and they just don't have the necessary rate of force development to use them. Maybe they have really bad coordination, but it is gonna be easier for someone with a higher baseline vertical to dunk. Now on the far side of the continuum, you might be someone whose baseline is really low and they're not a crazy responder to vertical jump training. In this case, you have to stay consistent and your training has to be absolutely dialed. If you're one of these athletes, then I encourage you to consider one-on-one coaching with us. You can go to the website or you can email support and we can set that up for you. All right, the third thing that I wanna talk about is finishing technique. If you're someone who's getting the ball consistently above the rim, maybe the ball's hitting the back of the rim, then your finishing technique is poor. What I would encourage you to do is practicing low rimming. Now, low rimming has a lot of benefits. You get a lot of technical work when you're on a low rim and practicing finishing, but if you're really bad at this, the biggest thing is flicking your hand downward as the ball is eclipsing the rim. So you want at least 3/4 of the ball to be over the front of the rim. If the rim's really stiff, it's gonna be quite a bit harder. So try to find a rim that has a little bit of give. That way you can push with the top of your fingertips on at least a little bit of the top of the ball to push the ball downward. All right, the fourth thing that's limiting you from getting your first dunk is going to be your body weight. Now I've talked about this extensively, but if you have a very high fat mass, you're really gonna struggle with jumping higher. The reason why is because fat is non-functional. It's non-contractile, it doesn't help us jump higher, and it's ultimately gonna be mass that we have to overcome when we're pushing downward into the ground. If this is you, I would encourage you to get something called Macro Factor. It is a tracking app. It's super easy to use. Essentially, you track everything that you eat in a given day and you track your weight. It'll give you an estimate of your caloric expenditure, which will allow you to eat a little bit less than that, which will help you lose fat mass and maintain your muscle mass. Ideally, we wanna see our athletes in the single digits when it comes to percent body fat. You could change absolutely nothing about your training and lose a few percentage points in your fat mass, and you'll end up jumping significantly higher by changing that one variable. The fifth thing stopping you from getting your first dunk is consistency. If you are inconsistent in your training, you're not dunking regularly, you're not trying to dunk regularly, and you're practicing misses, then you are heavily limiting your ability to get that first dunk. We wanna practice not only coming into the gym and making a routine out of training and training hard, but also consistent practice of makes. Practicing misses will teach you to have the incorrect technique when you go up to make your first dunk. This also applies to the person lobbing the ball in your lobs. If you're doing a self lob, you need to make sure the ball is in the same exact place every single time. Additionally, if someone is lobbing the ball to you, the same thing applies. You need to make sure the ball is about 3/4 higher than the top of the rim. When it comes to consistency, it's a lot to do with mindset and understanding that these things take time. It's about being bought in and it's about showing up every day regardless of how you feel. The sixth limitation is going to be injury. If you have a laundry list of injuries, then you're not going to be able to try hard on your dunk attempts. You might have knee pain, you might have Achilles pain, you might have muscle pulls, and these are ultimately going to limit your intent and your effort in a given dunk session. I've coached thousands of athletes, and the number one thing that determines if they're gonna jump high or not is if they are hurt. If they're hurt, there's no way they're gonna be jumping their highest, and I would absolutely encourage you to get healthy first before you go out and have consistent dunk sessions or try to get your first dunk. And the seventh thing is going to be, are your tendons too stiff or are you too weak? If you're an athlete who has very, very stiff tendons and you're really weak, you're not going to be able to coordinate a jump well because you're not gonna get a lot of elastic energy from your tendons. Tendons are able to store and release energy much faster than a muscle. Muscles are limited by the contractile tissue, whereas tendons are limited by their material properties. So if you have a very, very stiff tendon and you can stretch it a lot, like a heavy guy on a stiff trampoline, then you're gonna be able to get a lot of elastic return from a jump. However, if you're someone who has incredibly stiff tendons and very weak muscles, you're not gonna be able to stretch the tendon and deform it at all, and it means you're not gonna get as much energy out of your jump. Now, the reason that tendons are either stiff or not stiff has to do with two things. One is going to be your genetic predisposition for tendon stiffness, and the second is going to be the type of training that you've done. If you're an athlete with very short, thick tendons, then they're probably gonna be really stiff, and it might be really hard to stretch that tendon. The thing that compounds this is doing too much strength work. We know that strength work stiffens tendons, specifically hypertrophy and max strength work, and over time, if that tendon gets too stiff, you're not gonna be able to use it in a jump. If you are this athlete, we know that distance running can actually function to soften tendons. It makes them more efficient over time, but it also does show in the research that distance runners do have less stiff tendons than athletes like sprinters. So doing things like extensive plyos, doing things like longer runs can actually soften the tendon and get it to function a little bit more compliantly. The downside to this is that you're not getting good neural stimulus regularly. So you do have to balance this out. I would encourage you early in the year to do more extensive tempos, more distance running, more extensive plyos, and this will soften the tendon, which will allow you to stretch it better than if you were just hammering max strength work. Now, if you're on the other side of this, where maybe you come from a distance running background or something with really high volumes, then your tendons are probably really efficient, but they're not very good at storing and releasing a lot of energy. So to fix this, you need to do max strength work. Max strength work will function to stiffen that soft tendon, and as you get stronger, your rate of force development will go up, which will allow you to stretch it, which will make jumping high easier. That's the video, guys. I hope it helped, and I'll see you next time.